My name is Josh Unlin. I am part of the AFRL Ops cadre here. So our focus is on mission operations. Everything from helping our missions here kind of figure out what the very early stages of ops looks like, all the way through training their team and then actually operating out once we launch. The UNP office here has asked me to come and give a talk to you guys about ground stations and mission operations. Let's jump right in. So, like I said, I'm going to talk about ground systems and mission operations, and we're going to start here with ground systems. So, there are two primary components when you talk about your ground system. These are your ground stations, which can also be called the ground network. So, this is the actual physical antenna and hardware that you're using to talk to your satellite. Obviously, we need some way to bridge that gap between ground and space, and this is how we do it. It can be your own or commercial. It includes everything from the radio, the antennas, the rotor, like I said, all that physical infrastructure on the ground, anything that you need to talk to your satellite. This will be heavily intertwined with your comm system. You got to make sure that they're compatible, they're on the same band, and they can actually reach each other. That will be both influenced by and influence your link budget. So, depending on how good of a radio you have on your satellite, what orbit you're in, that will all influence what kind of antenna you actually need on the ground. The other side of that is your ground data system. That'll sometimes just be shortened to ground system. This is what you are actually interfacing with. It's your computers that are in the mock, it's all the servers behind that infrastructure, and it's the kind of bridging gap between your ground station and the user, basically. This is your TTNC, your command control and telemetry interface. Any other operator-facing tools, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Your front-end processor, which is just one of those, for the sake of this talk, it's one of those bridging tools that you guys are going to need. And it also includes like your computers, the networking equipment. So this is, like I said, it's the hardware and software kind of in the mock that connects you between your ground station and the user. A few other things that you may need depending on your mission. Your payload ground, depending on your payload, you can have that separate from the normal kind of bus and TTNC software and mock. We have done a few split, usually called them POCs, Payload Operations Centers, and MOCs, Mission Operations Center. It's not a typical thing, but it might be needed for your mission, depending on what you guys are doing. Another thing that you can look into are space comm networks, being able to communicate with your satellite with other satellites that are in space. I think Iridium is one of the more popular and commercially accessible ones right now. There may be a couple others. It's just something to look into depending on your mission needs. So what are the components of this ground system? We will start kind of on the satellite side. The antenna itself, that will then move into your amplifier or your transmitter and receiver. That gets converted so that it's something that the modem can actually understand. You may also have that simulation and test box there that's recording anything that your antenna is getting into itself so that you can play that back later to see really what was going on during that pass and be able to test things and your ground chain when you aren't physically talking to the satellite. It can be very helpful for troubleshooting, training. That yellow line is roughly where the ground station and the ground data system break up. It's not always exactly there, but it's kind of the generally accepted. I don't think you guys need to worry about any crypto as far as I'm aware. So you should only just have the one, and you don't need to pass through a crypto and then another FEP. You should be good there. Then those 6 boxes on the far side, those are all kind of the ground software that you're going to be using. So your scheduler, how do you actually schedule your contacts on the ground station, your ground network, whatever you're using there, and also make sure that those are on board the spacecraft. Your command and control, this is what you're using to send out commands to the satellite itself. It's different than your monitor and control. I believe that's referring to the software that you would use to actually control the antenna itself. You need some kind of data archive. If you can't look at the data that you get down and double check through everything, then you're kind of not really doing much. Seeing the live feed is great. You should absolutely be doing that so you can monitor your satellite's health and state of health. But not being able to go back and reference that, train it over time, and then actually see the data from your experiment means that everything's kind of useless. Make sure that you have some kind of archive or a database storage there. Your mission planning tools. Everything that you guys do should be thought of ahead of time. I don't think that we get super deep into a battle rhythm today. Algorithm discussion today, but make sure that you guys have some kind of mission planning cadence and the software to support that. It's something you should think of well ahead of time, but we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into the ops section of this. And orbit determination. You can have the best antenna in the world on the ground, but if you don't know where to point the thing because you haven't figured out where your orbit actually looks like, then it doesn't really help you much. So make sure you have some way of doing that. And then on the very far side, we have the operator themselves, you guys who are going to be sitting at the computer, actually talking to your satellite. So ground stations, you really have two options here. You can build your own. It's not too difficult if you're looking at UHF. It's a little bit more expensive for S-band, but it's still doable. And kind of anything outside of those is a lot more questionable and expensive. There are a lot of different kinds of kits. You can do a lot of different vendors. If this is the path that you guys want to go down, do a trade study, figure out what meets your needs, and follow that path. One of the downsides to this, though, is that you are really limited to one station. Even if you have multiple antennas, you're likely just going to be at one physical location, probably your university or somewhere nearby. So this means that you'll have fewer passes, you have less visibility than you would if you had multiple distributed stations. Going down this route also means that you are fully responsible for all the maintenance on it yourselves. Things break. It's just going to happen. You're going to need to service your antenna, and you will be fully responsible for that if it's your own. The other route that you can go down is to talk to ground station service providers, ground network providers. There are multiple mature capabilities out there. We have used 3 of them here at AFRL, I believe, KSAT, Atlas, and Viasat. Others exist out there. Amazon, I have not heard of Satnogs or Explore Major Tom before. They exist. So one of the benefits of this is that you have a wider variety of stations, and they're all around the world. You won't necessarily be using every single station that a provider can provide because you got to contract with each of them individually. But you have a lot more options, both in location and type. So you can find the dish that kind of exactly suits the needs for your mission. They will also help you out with frequency licensing and any kind of ground station testing that you're going to need to do. Frequency licensing can be a major pain in the butt. Having some help with that and people who already have kind of their own license that they can add you onto potentially is a massive boon for that, at least on the ground side of things. And like I said, any testing, any maintenance, that's going to be done by them. The downside to this is that it very well may be a lot more expensive than using your own, but it might not be. So a lot of companies will offer university discounts, and you aren't responsible for maintaining your own, buying your own. This is going to be something that you're probably going to have to do a trade study on to figure out what the cost benefits are, which one is going to improve your mission more overall, and fit the needs of what you guys are doing. Moving on to the ground data system. Some examples of software that we're using here. By the way, the image on the right side of the screen there, that is the recurve mock. That was one of the small sets that we flew about a year ago. I can tell that I'm one of the operators in that picture. The other guy's a bit too shadowed for me to figure out who he is, but it's kind of cool to see actual operations going on. And this may or may not be what your mock ends up looking like. Probably not, but you should have plenty of screens and spaces for the operators to sit. Anyway, onto the ground data system itself. Some examples of software in here that you're going to need: command database and a telemetry database. Every mission should have what's called a CTL, a command and telemetry list. This is everything that the spacecraft will accept as commands and all the telemetry that the spacecraft can send down to the operator. You need a command database so that you aren't physically building each of these commands every time you need to do it. Like, you shouldn't be starting from scratch every time you need a command. You should have a database that you can pull things from and then adjust some parameters as you send it up. And then a telemetry database to store the telemetry that you get down. We talked about earlier that you want to make sure that you reference the data that you can come down. So any kind of payload data as well that may be separate from your telemetry. Sometimes it's just included in the telemetry stream, which is nice. Sometimes you have to request it separately. Operator interface tools. These are really the buttons that the operator is pressing. How do they actually send those commands and view the telemetry that's coming down? If they're sitting in a database, that's great, but you need some way for you to pull them and access them and then actually do something with them. You may have some kind of automation on there. It makes things a lot simpler and can be a lot smoother, but it can also take a little while to get up to the place where you feel comfortable with your automation and how things actually work. You want to make sure you do plenty of testing before you just leave scripts to run your satellite. I mean, we all know how reliable programs can be sometimes. Alarming and alerts, some way to notify you when something is going on. Packet framing, any kind of error correction. Running a little short on time for this section, so I'm going to kind of breeze through the rest of these. Telemetry processing and displays. How do you actually see your trends, your state of health? Encryption and decryption, and then any kind of record keeping. This one I do want to hammer home a little bit. The same person is not always going to be operating. They shouldn't be operating for 24/7 ops, just one guy. So make sure that you have some kind of records or logs so that you can hand off between shifts and reference back to things that are going on beforehand. There are commercial products that do all of these. You can build your own Python scripts. And one thing that you should keep in mind is that data does not necessarily equal information. You can have all this wonderful data sitting in a database, but if no one is looking at it, trending it, manipulating it, it's not going to do any good. You're not going to be able to pull the info out of there and do anything with it and accomplish your mission. These are some of the references that were used for this section. And do we have any questions on ground systems?
With your experience, have you ordered the Allen Space S-band kit before, or do you know how much it costs?
I have not, and I'm not sure. I would definitely give them a bit longer than a day and a half before expecting a quote back. No, it's not one that I personally have used before. And we here tend to use either commercial ground stations or military assets. There's a Space Force satellite control network that we've utilized in some of our larger missions. But no, I've unfortunately don't have experience with the Allen Space kit itself. How much would an S-band ground station cost roughly? Yeah, I'm not sure. Like I said, we don't actually buy our own here. We use either commercial ground stations or Space Force assets. I might be a little biased considering that mission operations is my job and I'm part of our operations cadre here. But I do think that mission operations is one of, if not the most important part of any mission. You guys can build the best, most robust satellite, design the best experiments, but if you can't actually fly it, it doesn't do you a whole lot of good. So we're going to touch on the ConOps today. This is your concept of operations. It can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It can have a lot of different information in it depending on what exactly you're trying to accomplish here. Really what it is explaining what your satellite is going to be doing and then how you're actually going to be able to fly it. So what objectives do you need to accomplish and how do you accomplish those objectives? What data do you need to get and how do you get that data down? You need to be able to execute from this. A list of what you need to do is great, but the ConOps really is how do you do all of these things? So one way to do this is to talk about your different mission phases and the different modes that your spacecraft will be in. So phases are at the mission level, modes are at the spacecraft level. With phases, these are kind of what is the mission itself doing. What are your objectives here? These can be experiment objectives, these can be mission objectives, satellite objectives. For one example, every satellite is going to go through a LEOPS phase. This is launch and early operations. So immediately after you separate, what goes on? How do you first turn on your how everything works and what parts don't work and you have to work around them. And so that's when you kind of get into more of your experimentation and then how are you accomplishing all of those experiments? Modes are the state of your spacecraft. During each of those phases, what is on board your spacecraft and what are its capabilities? What components do you have turned on and active? What components do you have shut off and kind of sitting around so they aren't drawing power or potentially getting damaged by radiation? You should have several different modes. They list 3 there, survival, safe, and some kind of operational. You should also have a 4th, which is separation, immediately after launch, turning on all that initial stuff. Those are kind of like your bare minimum 4. We'll talk about safe mode a little bit more later on, with survival being like a bare minimum, something is going wrong, we need to basically shut off our satellite periodically, talk as little as possible. We're trying to extend operations as much as possible when something is going catastrophically wrong. A safe mode, like I said, we'll talk about a little bit later. It should actually be safe. It should turn off any non-critical components and point you in the direction of the sun while still being able to talk to the ground. And operational is when basically everything is on when it's needed, or at least can be turned on, pointing wherever you need it to, filling any kind of experiment objectives during that mode. But the key here for econops is that you need to describe both of these. So both the mission level, what is going on and how are we doing things, and the spacecraft level, what is going on and how are we doing things. Talking a little bit more about one of these experiments. So for this example experiment that we're going to be going through a little bit more here, the description, it's a pretty baseline mission data collect. I believe on this one, it's like imager, so it's taking pictures. We need to do 5 of these collects, 5 of these experiments to fulfill our success criteria. And this assumes that the mission is a site track data collect. So an imager, we're pointing at one specific location, we're taking a picture of it. So in describing this experiment, this is one way that we can do it. These 4 blocks here kind of describe the high level detail of what may be included in here, but it doesn't necessarily go through like what the full experiment plan is. So you may need to have a bit more detail on here, but we'll talk about the mode, what objectives and end products are we expecting to accomplish and get out of here, what is your entrance and exit criteria for each of these experiments, and what state is your vehicle going to be in and what actions are you going to take. So for this single image collect example that we have here, talking about the description, we need to make sure that the satellite is in its operational mode. So not safe mode, not survival mode, certainly not separation. We need to be in the right mode for it. We need to make sure that the operator schedules the collect ahead of time, the vehicle does the collect, and then that we get that data down afterwards. You can see down in our objectives, we have that experiment collect, we have that experiment data downlink. Make sure that you get the data down afterwards. Otherwise, you haven't really accomplished your experiment. This is true for most experiments. And that data that you want to get down, you also should define so that you know exactly what you're looking for and how to validate that you did it. So in this case, it's that single pass data collect with timestamp. It's that picture that you're getting down and the time that you took it. And the GPS data that says, yes, we were actually in the right place when we took this. For that entrance and exit, so before you get into it, before you actually start, you need to be looking at these and making sure that you have satisfied all of these entrance criteria. So the vehicle being in a healthy state, that will look a little different for every vehicle, that you actually have a target in mind and that your vehicle is in the right mode. And then to exit from it to say, yes, we accomplished our experiment, we are good. Make sure that all that data is downlink. Make sure that the experiment actually went off, that the schedule executed and completed successfully. And that if you were in any fault scenarios, if anything goes wrong here, that your experiment would kick you into the proper mode. Most often safe mode, but sometimes things aren't that serious and it can just cancel itself. That bottom part there is just describing what's on during this satellite's operational mode. So what subsystems there are, what the power state for each of those are. You can see here that for this image collect, we need everything to be on. We need our ADCS to be in fine point so that we can actually point accurately, so that we can take the right picture. And we have that data type coming down. We can see most of its telemetry, with the payload also sending down some mission data. In this case, it's an image. It can also be like log files, that kind of stuff. And then what resolution you're getting down that data. How often is it being collected so that you can downlink it later. So moving on to kind of the mission operations, we're going to continue that same example here in a second. So what it involves is the mission planning, figuring out what you're going to do ahead of time and coming up with your plan for, yes, this is the task that I want to execute today or next week or next month. And here are the steps that we need to do to get it ready to accomplish that task. The tasking itself, setting it up there, the plan, pass, task, execution. This can also be called your battle rhythm. How do you plan? How do you actually send it up there? How do you verify that it executed? And then how does that all loop back around to accomplishing your next objective, downlinking the data and then processing it afterwards? Hopefully, no one is wondering why you should care about operations now, but it is a common thing. People think, well, it's not going to matter until after launch, so I can put it off until right before. But this is not something that you should be putting off. You are already making assumptions about your operations. Every design decision that you guys make right now, whether it be about the vehicle, the ground, what software you have, what your mission is, influences how you're going to fly this thing. And if you don't consider that as you're making these decisions, you're going to end up with something that is very difficult or impossible to actually operate. You need to understand what information you actually need out of it and the tools that you need to execute and get those that information back. The tools that you need to task the satellite, to plan out things ahead of time, to process your data, to make sure that your vehicle is healthy, to read that telemetry coming down. Everything here, you need to maintain the ability to understand what your satellite is doing. And they call it provide solutions in orbit here, but it's kind of like task it and then resolve any anomalies that will happen. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Just going into that one experiment, this is kind of what it looks like from an operations perspective, from when actually flying it. You need to choose that image target. You need to determine when you can actually see that image and when you can make that collect. You need to schedule it ahead of time on board the spacecraft and make sure that spacecraft is configured to actually do it. The spacecraft then needs to execute it. Then it needs to store the data that it took, downlink it to you, and then you need to be able to analyze it afterwards. So you can see that the actual thing that we would think of as the experiment, that executing the collect, that taking that picture, is only a very small part of this whole operations chain. So your cadence, your battle rhythm, whatever you want to call it, how are you running your experiments? What are the drivers for each of these steps? What is your manning going to look like? During high tempo ops, when you have a lot of things going on that need to happen in rapid succession, either due to a kind of more complicated experiment or an anomaly going on, that's going to look very different from your normal, chill, low manning operations. You need to consider both of those phases and how those are going to differ from each other. How long do things actually take? Your estimates that you make it right now ahead of time, sitting there on paper being like, oh yeah, it should take maybe a pass or two to execute on all this stuff, might not actually be true once you're on orbit. Things can take a whole lot longer based on like data budgets, anomalies, life and operations in general. Nothing is ever exactly how you planned it, especially pre-launch. So being able to adjust to that and be a little bit flexible once you get on orbit is going to be important. Mission planning really falls into this, and it's giving structure to this cadence, I should say. So you could start with the big picture, your phase planning, your kind of long-term plans. What does our nominal phase look like? What do these experiments look like? And then you break that down into about a weekly plan normally. So what is next week going to look like? What experiments do we want to accomplish here? What vehicle maintenance tasks do we need to do? And you break that down even smaller into a daily plan or a shift plan. What does tomorrow look like? Out of those things that we identified we wanted to do this week, what are we accomplishing each day to build up to actually execute on this plan? And then that narrows down even further to the past plan. What are we doing during our contact to execute on the task that we want to do today, this week, this phase? Let's not waste any time during here. We need to make sure we plan things out ahead of time so that you can actually accomplish what you want to do. And you can see on the other side there, it's a loop. You can start from the strategic plan, looking at your data and any state of health tests you want to do. You need to do, I should say, you need to make sure that your vehicle is healthy. If your vehicle breaks, then you can't accomplish your experiment. Breaking that down a little bit further into the tactical mission planning. So what do you need to do, like I said, next week, next day, next pass to actually accomplish that? Get approval for it and then execute on it. You should always have at least two-person verification for any plan that you're making, any commands that you're sending up. And then once you execute on it, how do you evaluate that it was a success or a failure? What are your hooks that you're looking at to determine the outcome of your event? And then how does that outcome feed back into your long-term plan? If it was a success, great, then how do you move on to the next step? Or do you need to do it again anyway to meet your objectives? And if it was a failure, how do you then replan long-term? Where do you fit in a reattempt, or where do you identify what went wrong and make those adjustments before you try it again? So it will all feed back into itself and loop around as you move through operations. Kind of looking at this on a like pass by pass basis here for our example experiment, those choose image targets and determining the collect window, that's going to be happening before you make contact with the vehicle for this experiment window. This really is the mission planning phase. You are planning out your mission, I guess, for then during the pass itself, that's where you're scheduling the collect on board. You can also be scheduling the configuration change if you need to do that, turning on and off components ahead of the experiment collect. Once you are out of pass, this will most likely be when you are actually collecting the image. Some experiments can happen during pass, but a lot of them are going to be happening out of paths when you aren't directly talking to it. So you need to make sure that those are on board and set to execute at the right time. And then once that actually executes, then you're back into another pass and downlinking that data. It could take one pass, it could take 2, 3, however long it takes to get all that data down. And analyzing it would be post pass most likely. So you can say, yes, we did accomplish this. Our mission was a success. For that mission planning, that pre-pass, one of the things you should be thinking about right now are what tools do you need for this, both for determining the collect window, for scheduling ahead of time, looking at it from a weekly plan perspective. It's a lot broader. What do you actually want to do? What windows do you have to actually do those things? On your daily plan, we'll then break that down a little bit more into your past plans. What are you doing? And then creating the schedule itself. Building out that schedule, it's tool dependent. Like I said, you should be thinking about your tools well ahead of time. Consider the needs of the mission and how you're actually going to accomplish each of those steps. What telemetry and commands are most important here? Your state of health telemetry is probably your most important, almost always. So how do you know that your vehicle is healthy? How do you get that down, and how do you read it and display it in a way that your operator can clearly see what's going on and when things aren't going well? So, and then for commands, how do you sequence those commands? How do you decide which ones get sent up in which order? How do you handle commands that don't actually make it up? How do you verify that commands did make it up to your vehicle? Are you making sure to turn on and off your subsystems when you need them and then when you don't need them anymore? What steps do you need to take before you collect? Like I said, this is your vehicle configuration, what needs to be on, what telemetry should be coming down and being stored, what your attitude is going to look like, how do you point, how are you going to slew there, figuring out how long that configuration is going to take. So you can plan it so that it happens well before you need to actually execute on that collect, and that you aren't trying to configure your vehicle in the middle of when it should be taking a picture. What state do you return to after you execute on that collect? For scheduling itself and coming into your pass, you should always be assessing the state of your health at the beginning of every pass and fully recognizing that you may be changing your plan for that pass based on what the state of health is saying. If everything's looking good and healthy and you're comfortable with it, then you can move on to your plan. If things aren't looking good and comfy and it's either a full-on anomaly or things just aren't looking quite right, don't be afraid to cancel that pass and then try it again later. The last thing that you want to do is make your satellite worse and try and do things that it's not healthy enough to do. So during this pass, make sure that you take a look at the pass ahead of time and try and figure out about kind of a rough estimate on what the quality of that pass is going to be like. What elevation does it pass over your antenna? Does it actually go over any kind of elevation mask that your antenna will have on it? Is the signal going to be strong enough to both command and receive? And how will you know that you actually have commanded your vehicle to do the things that you want it to? Basically, how do you know that your commands have been put on board the vehicle and that the vehicle has accepted them and is ready to execute on them? On that state of health, how do you know the health of your vehicle? Some of the telemetry that we suggest looking at are the vehicle state. If you expect to be in a nominal mode, but you're suddenly in a safe mode when you come up, good indication that something's gone wrong if you designed your vehicle properly. What components are turned on and off? That's what that EPS switch states mean. What does your thermal look like? Are your temperatures still good? Are you in the right attitude? How's your power looking? The battery power? We will put a pin in the whole anomaly resolution thing for now, that whole vehicle state dropping into a safe mode. We'll come back to it, but you should have one. We'll talk about it in a bit. During the experiment itself, this should theoretically be the easiest part. I mean, everything should be on board your vehicle already. You aren't actually talking to it. It's just doing its thing based on what you told it to do. What exactly this looks like is going to be unique for every mission, depending on your experiment. Like I said, most of them are going to happen outside of a pass. Depending on the experiment, you might have live commanding for it, or you might need live commanding for it if it's something a little bit more risky that you want to make sure things executed properly before moving on to the next step. Like we said earlier, what state are you coming into at the end of the experiment? we want to make sure that your vehicle is not running full power when it doesn't need to be. That's a great way to drain your battery and throw an anomaly. Afterwards, you'll have another pass to downlink the data, or 2 or 3. Once again, assess that state of health. Immediately take a look, examine your telemetry, make sure everything's looking good there. And then what is the priority for the data that you're getting down? Usually this is going to be your experiment data has a higher priority, but depending on what your state of health sees, you may want to get more vehicle telemetry down instead to make sure that everything's actually looking good and healthy, or if something has gone wrong, trying to figure out what actually went wrong, and what are your steps forward to address it. How do you actually ask for the data coming down? Oftentimes, your payload data won't be stored in the same way as your system telemetry. It'll be pictures, it'll be log files, and you have to request those from the vehicle separately, often using different tools or a different subset of the tool that you're using here. Afterwards, how do you analyze the data? What time frame do you need to analyze it in? If you need to look over all the data that you got before you can move on to the next experiment, that's going to have a little bit of a different cadence than if the experiments are independent of each other and one doesn't really affect the other. And like I said, this may be multipass depending on the size of your data as far as downlinking it goes, and then you can do the analysis in between passes because the data's on the ground. So once again, don't let operations be an afterthought. These boxes here are some of the software that you're going to need. Anything from predicting the vehicle's time and position to actually commanding it, scheduling it, both on the vehicle and on the ground, controlling the dish, visualizing that data, processing that telemetry that's coming down, storing that data, and doing analysis on it, any kind of post-processing tools you're going to need afterwards. This is a lot to do. Some of it may be commercial, some of it you will almost certainly have to build yourself. So think about it well ahead of time, begin working it in as early as possible, and making any kind of changes or adjustments that you need to before you launch. So, anomaly resolution, we're coming back to that pin that we put in just a few slides ago. Things are going to go wrong. It's not an if, it is a when. About 11% of CubeSats that launch are dead on arrival, 6.2 have an early loss, and all the rest will have some kind of anomaly at some point. Most likely multiple, assuming that the first one doesn't completely kill your satellite. And how do you avoid it killing your satellite? We'll talk about a bit. But there are two different kind of types of anomalies here, ways that you can think about them. There are the more accessible anomalies, ones that you can actually kind of do something about as you see them. When that telemetry comes down, when you're assessing the state of health, you can see that your temperatures look a little weird, or your power is a bit low, or your attitude isn't pointing quite right, your star tracker isn't picking up the stars. And then since you can identify that problem early on before it snowballs, you can start to figure out how to fix it. There are also anomalies that you can't really control. These are things that are going to happen out of pass and then will surprise you when you come up into pass. Watchdog timers. Hopefully these ones, well, some of them may not surprise you, depending on your vehicle, you may have others. So these are basically timers on board your vehicle that are watching for different components and keeping track of how long either they're gone, or there can be command watchdog timers as well, counting how long it's been since your vehicle's had a last contact. And then once that time expires, it'll take some action on board your vehicle to get into a safer mode. Subsystem resets. Computers will turn themselves on and off, especially when they're in a high radiation environment like space. How do you handle that? You should make sure that you have fault protection on board your vehicle that are watching for all of these things and then can react to them, because you will not always be talking to your satellite and not always be able to react to these things yourself. One anomaly example that we had on one of our missions, this was a very early one in the mission. The satellite was power negative. Analysis was done beforehand, well before launch. As soon as the vehicle separated from its rocket, as soon as it separated, it should have been power positive. Everything should have been looking good. But they noticed that it was power negative. They saw this in their telemetry. They looked at their state of charge telemetry, and they looked at the solar panel input telemetry and saw that it wasn't reading what it should have. It wasn't really reading much of anything. And after looking at this telemetry, they started talking to the different causes and figured out that the solar panel that they had planned on being their primary solar panel, the one that was on their main sun pointing axis, had failed. It wasn't actually working. Fortunately, they had several other solar panels that they were able to readjust their sun safe mode to make that their primary axis instead. They saw that there was a problem, figured out the cause of it, and then were able to figure out a solution. So some of the takeaways here, configurability. If you are locked into one mode, one specific state for everything that you're in, but something goes wrong with one of the key components for that, then you can't really fix the problem. In this case, if they had not been able to readjust what their primary axis for pointing was, they wouldn't have had power and the mission would have failed before it really even started. And pre-uplink testing. So well before they launched, before they got into contact with the vehicle at all, they had done their power analysis, so they knew what it was supposed to look like and knew that it wasn't looking right when it came on. And they actually started talking to it, and they knew what the telemetry was telling them and what that most likely meant on the vehicle itself. When something's in space, you guys can't just go up and take a look at it if something's going wrong. Being able to, just from a few data points, figure out what the most likely cause of and how you can then react to that is crucial, and you only get that from testing beforehand. Some of these miscellaneous best practices, safe mode, I've mentioned a couple of times. This should be the mode that you default down to whenever there's an anomaly on board your vehicle, and you just want to shut everything else off, stop any planned commands that are already on board, and point it at the sun. It seems a little counterintuitive, but make sure that your safe mode is actually safe. You aren't going to control when it goes into it most of the time, and it may need to sit in its safe mode for quite a while, possibly tumbling, hopefully at least having one face point at the sun with your solar panels, but making sure that whatever you have on during your safe mode and whatever you tell the satellite to do during its safe mode is safe, and you can kind of sit in it for a long, if not indefinite period of time. Your perspective, we talked about your ConOps, and you guys are going to be sitting there developing it. You may not be the ones actually flying it. You may not be thinking from an operator point of view, from someone who actually has to use these plans that you're coming up with. I have seen some fantastic plans that sound great on paper and aren't really executable. They didn't take in all the software into account that we would need, or the timeframes that we would need to accomplish all of these things. And that final bullet here, test on the ground with as representative of a ground system as possible. Make sure that you're familiar with your ground system and training people on the ground system that you're actually using. If you guys are fortunate enough to have an EDU, an engineering development unit, that's representative of your spacecraft, test on that too. Try and hook your ground system up to that and get as much kind of realism in there as possible, both on your testing and on your training. If the guys hadn't done all that testing ahead of time to know what their telemetry should have looked like and what the most likely problem was when the telemetry wasn't looking the way that they expected, they may not have ever identified the problem and been able to fix it to have a successful mission later on. So some more mission operations things that you'll eventually need to think about, but that we didn't have time to talk about here, is your teaming. Who was actually going to be flying this thing? Who is going to hold what's called satellite control authority? This is kind of the ability to make decisions about what's happening on your satellite. As nice as it sounds, you cannot fly a satellite by committee, especially when things are going wrong or you need a high tempo operations for any reason. You need one person in that room who can make decisions and say, this is the path that we're going to go down. Let's start executing. Otherwise, we will just end up talking about it for days on end and not actually doing anything. And what are the roles and responsibilities for each of those, for each member in each position of your team? Having those be clearly defined, making sure that everybody knows what their job is and what their job isn't, helps both to make sure that every task has somebody assigned to it and that people aren't being stretched too thin and trying to do way too many things because it wasn't defined ahead of time and now we have a gap we need somebody to fill. Flight rules, so these are what you can and cannot do while you're flying, restrictions that you shouldn't cross for vehicle safety or policy reasons. An example of this can be never point our expensive camera directly at the sun, and then making sure that those are followed and how you program those both into your ground system and then train your operators on them so that they don't violate these flight rules. Training. How do you actually train people up on operations? This is a very new concept for a lot of people. Satellite mission operations is a rather niche field that people aren't going to have much experience in, especially at the college level. So how do you train people up and get them ready for that? And then the specifics of planning. How do you review your plan afterwards? What does your cadence actually look like? And what does that user interface actually look like for your planning? This also goes for kind of general facilities and user interfaces. Where are you actually flying out of? What does your mock look like? And what kind of softwares and UIs are in that? Some key takeaways from this talk, specifically about ConOps. Assumption validation. You need to make sure that any assumptions that you're making right now in vehicle design, planning, and experimentation are actually going to work once you get to the operations phase. Catch any missing pieces that you may have. There's a lot of tools that go into accomplishing a lot of different tasks to make sure that any satellite is actually able to fly. Take a look through your process again and see where those gaps are. And make sure that you have hooks in the system for that anomaly resolution. Make sure that you have the right telemetry coming down and that you can configure things on board your vehicle to fix the problems that will inevitably happen. The problems that you create now most likely won't be a problem until later. You guys aren't launching anything like right now, so it'll be somebody else's problem probably. You may not be there to provide a solution, so try to think of solutions ahead of time and avoid those problems wherever possible. That's kind of all I have for you guys right now. Thanks everybody for coming and listening.